Hey guys, welcome to another PSVR2 Without Parole op-ed. Today I wanted to tackle something I know a lot of you have been talking about. And actually on that note, before we get started, thank you all so much for giving me these great topics. It's your comments that get me thinking and writing these op-eds. So the most recent surge of comments that I've seen were on my newest rendition of the every PSVR2 game in development video. Now in the video I list over 70 games in development, and despite the inclusion of Resident Evil Village and Call of the Mountain, it actually is quite a lot of indie games, which led a lot of you to be concerned about not just the launch lineup for PSVR2, but also what's to come post-launch. Some of you are worried that PSVR2 will be a repeat of PSVR1 with just a few standout AAA titles, a ton of indies, and worst of all, a lack of first-party support from Sony themselves. So first and foremost, let's examine how the video was made. Sony didn't publish a list of every PSVR2 game in development, and then I copied and pasted that list and made it into a video. In fact, Sony has nothing to do with any of this. They've said very little about what PSVR2 games are in development. And as of this filming, they haven't even confirmed the entire PSVR2 launch lineup. I've been compiling this list for the better part of a year, maybe longer, keeping an eye on Twitter, finding out which developers are talking about PSVR2, and staying in contact with every developer I know in order to find out their PSVR2 plans. And there are plenty of developers that I have no relationship with whatsoever. In fact, the bigger the studio gets, the less likely it is that I know anybody that works there. And so that's the reason that so few of the games we know about are AAA or first party. Because you're not going to hear about those games from me. You're going to hear about those games from Sony themselves. The Gran Turismos of the world won't be heard about until Sony wants us to hear about them. And luckily, between now and launch, Sony has plenty of time and plenty of opportunities to talk about these games. I mean, I'd love to see a PSVR2 State of Play, or maybe even see PSVR2 at Jeff Keighley's Game Awards, but who knows. I do have one other thing on my mind before we get to the actual topic at hand, and that's that Sony's kicking things off really right this time with one of their biggest first-party IPs front and center. Call of the Mountain is a PSVR2 exclusive game, something that Sony didn't seem willing to do that much of last gen. Sure, on PSVR1 we got Gran Turismo Sport, kind of, and Wipeout Omega Collection, but both of those games were playable on the flat screen. And Everybody's Golf VR, as good as it was a single-player only game, and it was super light on content. I think this time around, they know they need more full-fledged games from recognizable IPs, but I also think it's important that we know something, and that's that behind closed doors, Sony was equally committed to PSVR 1, but the power of the OG PS4 just didn't allow them to deliver the games they wanted to deliver, so a lot of first-party projects got shelved early on. Projects that PlayStation 5 and PSVR 2 will make possible. But let's get back to the launch lineup specifically. For a lot of us, I think there's easily 2 or 3 must-have games, and I think Call of the Mountain might be the easiest one to be excited about. Yeah, it might not be as long as a traditional Horizon game, and I know that the early impressions of combat were a little bit concerning, but there's still so much we don't know about it. I'm pretty sure that even people that went hands-on were only able to play about 15 minutes of this 8-hour game. I mean, there's climbing and combat, crafting and exploration, and let's be honest, the trailers make it look like the most beautiful VR game ever made, and I just can't wait to see what this looks like in a 4K headset. Plus, think of the number of people out there who PSVR2, this will be their first VR headset ever. So I think with Call of the Mountain, Sony wants it to be VR AF and just as immersive as possible, taking advantage of every single feature that the PSVR2 headset has to offer. Now, it might not even be fair to talk about this next game because Resident Evil Village, despite the amount of coverage it's gotten, is still not technically confirmed as a PSVR2 launch title, but I think it's pretty likely that it will be one. And if it is, then sign me up immediately. Resident Evil 7 on PSVR 1 was easily my most played game of the last 6 years. I rolled credits, 6 or 7 times. And it's not just because the game was great, it's because the replayability was through the roof. There was unlockable weapons and perks, not to mention a somewhat remixed Madhouse difficulty. Now, I've heard Village isn't nearly as scary as Biohazard was, but honestly, I don't even care. I held off playing this one assuming we'd get a VR version of it eventually. It's finally happening. It's kind of a dream come true, and by all reports, it looks as good or better than the PS5 version. Now, I could go on and on about a few other games that have been confirmed for the PSVR 2 launch, like Switchback, I guess is another big one. Considering Supermassive's history, this game shouldn't even exist. Or the stunning photorealistic Kayak VR Mirage, or Undead Citadel that we've literally been waiting 4 years for. And yes, I know a lot of you are disappointed that the launch lineup consists of some PC VR and Quest ports, but at least we're getting them, and at least we're getting the best versions of them. And again, like I just mentioned, PSVR2 will be a lot of people's first VR headset. Not everyone owned the Quest or PSVR1. These games will be brand new to a good number of PSVR2 owners. And maybe the cartoony art style will turn a few people off, but that doesn't mean they're not good games. Now, Jim Ryan said there'd be 20 major titles at the PSVR2 launch, which I think actually creates more questions than answers. First, what are the 20 titles, and what does Jim Ryan consider to be major titles? Is Demeo a major title? What about Star Wars Tales from the Galaxy's Edge? These are going to be fun games, and maybe even important games to some people. But are they major? I don't know. But the number 20 tells me that we still have at least a couple more reveals, which Sony themselves have said will be posted on the PlayStation blog soon, whenever that is. So let's stop and assess what we actually know right now. There's a bunch of quality titles, a couple AAA exclusives, and a ton of free PSVR1 upgrades, meaning that you'll have Pistol Whip and No Man's Sky and Zenith, The Last City, at launch for PSVR2 with big upgrades. And in my book, this all combines to make PSVR2 the best VR launch lineup we've ever seen. And if you want to take it even further, this might even be the best launch lineup for any console ever. If you've been watching the channel, then you know I'm a huge retro gamer, and I've been through a lot of console launches. And a lot of consoles that had an amazing lifespan had horrific launches. I mean, go back to the N64, which had a grand total of 2 games at launch. I know that's an extreme case, but I mean, even look at the PlayStation 2. The PlayStation 2 had a great launch, but I don't think we're actually terribly far from that with what we know about PSVR 2 right now. All we'd need to outclass it is what, maybe the announcement of Gran Turismo 7 VR, which I think at this point is highly probable. So if this is in fact the best VR launch lineup we've ever seen, and one of the best console launches we've ever seen, then why are we holding PSVR 2 to some different standard? If the current launch lineup is already this good, and there are more games still to be announced for launch, and there are more games coming post-launch, then what's the problem? Well, we know what the problem is, and the problem was PlayStation VR 1. Resident Evil 7 showed us what the headset was capable of just a few months after launch, and with very few exceptions, we almost never saw that level of quality again for the next 6 years. We wanted full-length games. We wanted full-featured games. We wanted full AAA flat-screen games that were playable in VR. And over the course of PSVR 1's lifespan, we got so few of them. So yes, you have every right to be concerned that history will repeat itself. And I'm not here to promise you anything. I can't tell you that Sony will have major first-party PSVR 2 games every year, because I simply don't know that. And because of all that, I have to say that I do admire the people who are able to restrain themselves, the people who are willing to take the wait-and-see approach and make sure that there are more titles coming down the pipeline before they take the plunge. But for me personally, even if this channel didn't exist, I would buy the headset day one. Honestly, even if Village was the only confirmed launch title. But that's just me. I can't wait to play Horizon and Switchback and Village and dive back into Zenith and, I don't know, maybe even play No Man's Sky or After the Fall. But this isn't all about me. I want to know what you guys think about this, honestly. Let me know in the comments below your thoughts on the current launch lineup, what Sony has told us so far. If there's enough there to convince you to buy a PSVR 2 on day one. And if not, what other games would you need to be announced in order to pull the trigger? And if those games need to be launch games, or if you're okay with just knowing that they're coming eventually. Let me know. I really am curious what everyone's thinking. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I love you all.